The morning she walked into my son's hospital room, Marcus hadn't spoken her name in 19 years. He was 32 years old, sitting in a chair with wheels, and he had just signed paperwork that made him the beneficiary of a $4 million estate. She was standing in the doorway holding a coffee from the hospital cafe, wearing a cream blazer that probably cost more than Marcus's first adapted van, and she was smiling the way people smile when they've rehearsed it in the car on the way over. I was there. I saw her face before she arranged it. I saw the thing underneath the smile. And I had been waiting for exactly this moment for 11 months. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only place this makes sense. My name is Gerald Adkins. I turned 63 in October.
I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, the kind who looks at buildings other people think are fine and finds the one crack, the one compromised joint, the one load-bearing wall that's quietly transferring stress in the wrong direction. I retired 4 years ago, but the habit never left me. I still walk into rooms and look for the thing that shouldn't be there. I still notice the weight-bearing points. I still know the difference between a structure that's solid and a structure that only looks solid from the outside. I drive a 2009 Buick LeSabre with 187,000 miles on it. My neighbor Franklin, who retired from the post office and grows the best tomatoes on the block, once told me I was the most unpretentious man he'd ever known with money in the bank. I told him I didn't have money in the bank. He laughed. I laughed. We talked about his tomatoes for 20 minutes, and I went home. What Franklin didn't know, and what most people didn't know, is that I don't think about money the way people who flash it think about money. I think about it the way an engineer thinks about load-bearing capacity. It's not interesting in itself. It's only interesting in what it can carry, what it can hold up, what it can protect. I have one son. His name is Daniel. He is 37 years old. He was married for 5 years to a woman named Renee Collier, who became Renee Adkins on a Saturday in May 18 years ago, in a ceremony at a venue in Savannah that I helped pay for, standing next to a man I was doing my best to believe in. Renee was beautiful and quick and funny, and she laughed at Daniel's jokes even when they weren't that good, and I thought, this might work. I thought it might work the way you think a repaired beam might hold, cautiously, with qualifications you don't say out loud. It didn't work.
Renee left when Marcus was 3 years old and had just received his diagnosis. Cerebral palsy, mild to moderate, affecting primarily the left side of his body and his speech in ways that the occupational therapist said were manageable with early intervention. She used the word manageable. Renee heard lifelong and complex and adaptive equipment and therapy schedule. And 4 months after the diagnosis, she sat Daniel down at the kitchen table and told him she couldn't do it. Not wouldn't, couldn't. She made a distinction. I've thought about that distinction for 19 years. She left on a Tuesday. She took her car, 2 suitcases, and a box of books. She left Marcus's drawings on the refrigerator. She left his adaptable cup with the weighted base on the kitchen counter. She left Daniel standing in the doorway of the house I had helped him buy, holding a 3-year-old boy who kept asking for his mama, with the particular patience of a child who doesn't yet understand that patience won't bring her back. I moved in 2 weeks later. Daniel never asked me to. I just showed up with a duffel bag and a box of my tools and told him I'd take the room at the end of the hall. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Dad," and his voice cracked on the one syllable, and I said, "I know," and that was all we needed. I lived in that house for 11 years. I drove Marcus to speech therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I learned the difference between a good bracing for a cerebral palsy gait and a poor one, the same way I once learned the difference between a sound rivet and a cold one. I learned to read his speech before his speech became clear, the way you learn to read a building before you learn its blueprints, by paying attention, by being present, by not flinching at what's difficult to understand. Marcus grew up to be someone I would have admired even if I hadn't watched every step of it. He has a dry sense of humor that sneaks up on you. He finished his degree in computer science in 5 years, 1 year over the standard, and spent 0 of those years feeling sorry for himself, which is more than I can say for a lot of people I've known with far fewer reasons. He works from home for a software company out of Seattle. He adapted everything: his keyboard, his mouse, his desk setup, his life. He doesn't ask for help he doesn't need, and he asks for it without hesitation when he does. That took a long time to get to. I know the years behind it. Daniel remarried 7 years ago. A woman named Sonia, who loves Marcus with a specific and practical love, the kind that shows up in calendar coordination and in knowing which side of the restaurant booth to give him, and in never, not once, making his adaptations feel like accommodations rather than just the way things are. Marcus calls her Mom. He started calling her that in year 2. Daniel came home and told me about it, and we both pretended we weren't as moved as we were. So that is the structure of our family. That's the load-bearing arrangement. And it was holding up just fine. Then, 11 months ago, last spring, my brother Calvin died. Calvin was 4 years older than me, and he was everything I am not in terms of personality, and everything I am in terms of character. He was loud where I am quiet, expansive where I am precise, and he spent the last 30 years of his life building a commercial real estate portfolio in Georgia and South Carolina that, at the time of his death, was worth approximately $11 million. Calvin had no children. He was married once, briefly, in his 30s, and the divorce was amicable enough that they stayed friends, and she passed 7 years before he did. Calvin came to every one of Marcus's school events he could get to. He called Marcus on his birthday without fail. He called him the engineer, even before Marcus decided on computers, because he said you could tell from the way the boy organized his toys. Calvin left his estate to 3 people. His housekeeper of 20 years, Dolores, received a generous sum and the house she'd helped him maintain for a decade. I received a portion, and Marcus received $4 million held in trust until such time as he turned 30 or his grandfather certified that he had the capacity to manage it, whichever came first. Marcus was 32. The estate was settled in March. The trust transferred in April. The paperwork was finalized in the hospital because Marcus had gone in for a planned hip surgery, a procedure to address a chronic issue in the joint that had worsened over the years. And Calvin's attorney had agreed to come to the hospital rather than make Marcus travel to his office afterward. I was in the room when Marcus signed. Daniel was there. Sonia was there. The attorney, a careful man named Bertram Howell, who had known Calvin for 20 years and showed it in the way he spoke about him, was there. No one had told Renee. No one had told Renee anything in 19 years, because Renee, after leaving on that Tuesday, had communicated exactly 4 times with Daniel. Once through an attorney to finalize the divorce, once via email when Marcus turned 10 to say she hoped he was well, once via a card when Marcus graduated high school, a card that arrived 2 weeks after the ceremony and contained no return address, and once, 4 years ago, via a social media message to Daniel, saying she was thinking about reaching out to Marcus and asking if that would be okay. Daniel had not responded to that message. So when Renee walked through the door of room 412 on a Wednesday afternoon in April, 2 days after Marcus had signed the estate paperwork, it was not by accident. Someone had told her. I sat with that fact for about 4 seconds before the engineering part of my brain started mapping the load paths. Who knew? The attorney's office. Daniel and Sonia. Me. The hospital staff had access to the room, but not to the estate details, which left the attorney's office. Bertram Howell called me that evening. Before I could say anything, he said, "Gerald, I need to tell you something that I should have told you this morning." One of his paralegals, a young woman who had processed the paperwork, had a college friend who was connected to someone in Renee's current social circle. He had discovered this 3 hours after Renee's visit. He was, he said, profoundly sorry. He had already begun the process of separating that employee from the firm. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold while I sat there, and I looked at the legal pad on my kitchen table, where I'd been keeping notes for the past 11 months, since the day Calvin died, and I started thinking about what the estate announcement might attract. I had started that legal pad 8 months before Renee appeared. I want to be clear about that.
Because I am a structural engineer, and I know what happens to stable structures when new load is applied without warning. Let me tell you about the morning Marcus was born. It was February, cold even for Savannah, and Daniel called me at 4 a.m., which was not unusual because Daniel, even in emergencies, has always been the kind of man who calls his father. I drove 40 minutes in the dark, and I was there by the time the sky started to lighten. Marcus arrived at 7:22 a.m., 7 pounds 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair, and the particular look of a person who has arrived somewhere he was planning to be. I held him for the first time, and I thought, whatever this child needs, he will have it. Not from wealth, from proximity, from presence, from the fact that I would be there. That thought is not complicated. It's not even particularly profound.
It's just the thing I decided, holding him in that delivery room in February, while Daniel was on the phone with his mother, who was flying in from Tampa, and Renee was sleeping, finally, after 14 hours of labor, her face still and exhausted and young. She was 26 years old that morning. I don't forget that. I don't forget that she was young, and that the life she'd signed up for was not the life that materialized. I don't excuse what she did, but I don't reduce her to a villain in a story either. What she did, leaving, was a failure of character and a failure of love and a failure of nerve. And Marcus carries it still, the way a building carries a previous repair, something that altered the load distribution permanently, even after the work was done. But she was 26, and frightened, and the world she'd expected had closed a door and opened one she didn't know how to walk through. None of that explains what she did 19 years later.
That I cannot frame as fear or youth or failure of nerve. That I can only frame as calculation. She stayed for 40 minutes that first visit. I was in the hallway when she arrived. I had stepped out to make a call, and by the time I came back in, she was seated in the chair beside Marcus's bed. And Marcus was looking at her with an expression I had never seen on his face before. And that expression broke something open in me that I kept very carefully contained. He looked like he was trying to decide if she was real. She had brought him a coffee from the cafe downstairs. She had brought one for Daniel, too, though Daniel, when he arrived 20 minutes into the visit, left his on the windowsill untouched. She was warm, and she was measured, and she said all the right things in the right order. And I watched her the way I watch a building I've been called in to assess, looking for the thing underneath the presentation, the stress distribution that the surface doesn't show.
She said she'd heard he was in the hospital, and she'd been worried. She said she knew she had no right to show up. She said she'd been thinking about this for years, about reaching out, about saying what she needed to say. She said she didn't expect anything. She said she just wanted him to know she was sorry. Marcus listened. He is good at listening. He comes by it honestly. I spent 11 years modeling what it looks like to listen without performing a reaction, and he absorbed it. He asked her a few questions, quiet ones, the kind that gather information without committing to a position. Where did she live now? What was she doing? Had she remarried? She lived in Charlotte. She was a consultant, she said, vaguely. She had been married and divorced. She had no other children. She said that last part with a particular weight. No other children. I noted the weight. Before she left, she touched his hand, briefly, on the railing of the bed. He let her. He didn't pull back.
He also didn't turn his hand over to hold hers, which was, I thought, as precise an assessment of the situation as anything I could have offered. After she left, Daniel looked at Marcus for a long time without speaking. Then Marcus said, "Dad, I'm okay." And Daniel said, "I know you are." And then they both looked at me, which is what they do when they want my read on something but don't want to ask for it directly. I said, "Let's give it a few days." That was all I said. But that night, I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and opened the legal pad, and I wrote down the date and the time and the description of everything I had observed, the same way I once documented a site inspection on a building in downtown Savannah that everyone else had signed off on, and that I had not been able to sign off on because I had seen the thing under the surface. 2 weeks later, Renee sent Marcus a card, then an email, then a request to meet for lunch if he was feeling up to it.
He was up for it. He agreed to lunch. He told me afterward. He also told me that he'd told her he appreciated the gesture and that he didn't need anything from her. And she had said, and I wrote this down exactly as he quoted it, "I don't need anything from you either, Marcus. I just want a chance to be in your life, if you'll let me." He was considering it. I said, "That's your decision to make. You know that." He said, "What do you think, Grandpa?" I said, "I think people are capable of change, and I think the timing of things matters, and I think you should go to lunch and trust what you see." He nodded. He wrote something on his laptop, then looked up and said, "The timing is a little convenient, isn't it?" I looked at him, 32 years old, in his adapted desk chair, with his quick, quiet eyes. I said, "It is." He said, "Are you worried?" I said, "No." That was almost true. What I was, more accurately, was watchful. And busy. Because by then, I had already made 3 phone calls, and I had already had 1 conversation with Bertram Howell that had nothing to do with the estate transfer, and I had already started the quiet, methodical work that my profession had trained me to do. You assess the structure. You find the fault lines. You document what you find. You don't move anything until you know where everything is. I want to say something here to anyone who's been watching these stories for a while, or who just found this one and hasn't decided yet if it's worth staying for. Every story I've told in this space has been about one thing: the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind of patience that other people mistake for passivity right up until they don't anymore. If that's something you recognize, if you've ever sat quietly in a room while someone underestimated you and known something they didn't know, then this is your place. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment below about a time when staying quiet turned out to be the right move. And then come back, because we're only just getting to the part where everything becomes clear. My late wife Margaret, Marcus's grandmother, Daniel's mother, was a probate paralegal for 22 years. She died of a stroke 8 years ago, fast, the way she would have wanted, without a long decline. She was the most organized human being I have ever known. She kept files on everything. She had a system for every category of paper that entered our house, and she could locate any document from the previous 30 years within 4 minutes. I know this because I timed her once, out of genuine curiosity, and she found a 1991 heating contractor invoice in 3 minutes and 48 seconds without breaking stride. What Margaret knew, because she had spent 22 years handling estate documents, is that money changes the shape of relationships. Not just the relationships that are obviously about money. All of them. She used to say, when the estate opens, the rooms get rearranged. You won't recognize the floor plan. I thought about that a lot in the weeks after Renee appeared. I also thought about what I knew about Renee's situation, which, over the course of 3 weeks and 2 conversations with a woman named Sandra Pruitt, a private investigator who had been referred to me by a former colleague, and whose manner was exactly as thorough and discreet as I had been told, had become considerably more detailed than Renee probably expected. Sandra called me on a Thursday evening with the second set of findings. I was in my kitchen, same legal pad, same cup of coffee I forget to drink. She told me what she'd found in a level voice, and I listened the same way, taking notes in the margins of the pad the way I take notes during a site inspection. Not reacting, just recording.
Renee Collier, now Renee Ostrander after a marriage that ended in divorce 4 years prior, was currently residing in Charlotte in a rental apartment. The consulting practice she had mentioned to Marcus was a one-person operation with minimal income documentation, according to public filings. She had approximately $14,000 in available credit across 3 cards, 2 of which had balances near their limits. She had a lease renewal coming up in 2 months. She had a car payment. She had, according to a public court record from Mecklenburg County, been named as a defendant in a civil case 14 months ago. A dispute with a former business partner about unpaid fees that had been settled out of court. Sandra paused. Then she said, "There's one more thing." The one more thing was that Renee had, in the weeks before she appeared at the hospital, done a series of online searches. Sandra couldn't tell me the exact searches. That's not how it works. But she could tell me, through other means I won't detail here, that Renee had been in contact with a financial advisor in Charlotte who specialized in estate and inheritance matters, and that this contact had taken place approximately 3 weeks before Marcus signed the estate paperwork. The estate paperwork had been scheduled. The date had been known internally for 6 weeks. The paralegal with the connection to Renee's social circle had processed the scheduling documents. I sat with that for a moment. Then I thanked Sandra. Then I sat alone in my kitchen until 10:30 at night, writing on the legal pad and drawing the structural diagram the way I would draw it for a building. The load, the transfer points, the path from origin to outcome. It was not complicated. The load was money. The transfer point was Marcus. The path ran through Renee. The question was what she intended to do with the path.
Let me tell you what Marcus's life has looked like from the inside, in case you've been assuming it was defined by what it lacked. He took apart and rebuilt his first computer at 14. Not because anyone made him, but because something wasn't working and he wanted to understand why, which is something he did not get from Renee and did not get from me either. It came from some place inside him that was entirely his own, the same way a river finds a course that no one designed for it. He was coding at 15. He had his first freelance client at 17, a small business in Savannah that needed a website. And he charged them fairly and delivered what he promised, and they referred him to 2 other clients. He has a group of friends he met in college, 3 of them, who play online games with him on Friday nights. He has a cat named Euler, spelled correctly, and the cat sleeps on the adaptive mat next to his desk chair.
He has opinions about coffee that he will share at length if asked, and at moderate length if not asked. He has read every science fiction novel written before 1980 that he considers worth reading, and he has a list of the ones he doesn't consider worth reading that he will also provide upon request. He told me once, when he was about 25, that the thing he resented most about his disability was not the physical limitation, but the way strangers looked at him and saw the limitation first, and him second, or sometimes not at all. He said it the way he says most things, directly, without lingering, the way you name a structural problem and then move on to the solution. He does not talk about his mother often. When he does, it is with a precision that is not coldness. He had said to me, the year he turned 20, over dinner, "I don't hate her, I just don't know her. They're different." I said yes, they were different. He said, "The leaving part wasn't the worst part." I waited.
He said, "The worst part was the way it happened, without asking what I needed, like I wasn't part of the calculation." He paused. "Like I was a complication." I said, You were never a complication. He said, I know that now. He picked up his fork. But she didn't know it when it mattered. I have thought about that sentence 10,000 times. She didn't know it when it mattered. It is the most precise description of the failure I have ever heard. And it is his. He made it himself. The lunches continued, 3 of them, over the course of 6 weeks. Marcus told me about each one, not in a reporting way, but in the way he tells me about anything he's processing. In pieces, with space between the pieces, sometimes over days. He was not naive about the situation. He told me on the 3rd lunch that he'd noticed she seemed interested in his work, in the nature of his income, in whether he'd done anything with Uncle Calvin's money yet.
He said she'd asked the money question carefully, which he noted specifically, because in his observation, careful questions about money were never really about curiosity. He also said she was kind to him in a way that felt real. He said that was the complicated part. I said, "You can believe both things." He said, "I know. I'm just trying to figure out what to do with both things." I said, "You don't have to decide anything right now." He said, "What are you doing, Grandpa?" He said it the way he says things he already knows the answer to. I said, "Making sure you're protected." He looked at me a long time. Then he said, "Good." In June, about 8 weeks after Renee's first visit, she asked Marcus if she could meet his grandfather. He told her I was around, and she was welcome to ask me directly, since he gave her my number. She texted me 2 days later and asked if I'd like to have coffee. I said yes. We met at a diner near my house on a Tuesday morning. She arrived 2 minutes before I did, which I noted. She was already seated when I walked in, which means she arrived early enough to choose the table and the positioning. She had chosen a booth near the window, with the light coming in behind her, which meant she could see my face clearly, and I had to look slightly toward a glare to see hers. It was not necessarily deliberate, but I noted it. She looked like the woman I remembered from 20 years ago, adjusted for time in ways that were not unkind. She was put together in a manner that said she had considered what impression she wanted to make, and made it. She stood when she saw me and held out her hand. I shook it. We ordered coffee. She opened with what I recognized as an apology prepared in advance. Sincere in its components, but assembled rather than spontaneous. She said she knew she had hurt people. She said she regretted leaving the way she did. She said she had spent years building the courage to reach out, and she was grateful Marcus had given her the opportunity. I listened. I did not fill silences when she created them, which is a technique, leaving space for the other person to fill it, because people tend to overfill silence with the thing they're actually there to say. She said she wasn't looking for anything. She said she just wanted to be in Marcus's life if there was room for her. She said she knew that would be complicated. I said, Marcus is very capable of deciding what he wants. He's been deciding things without a lot of input from outside for 30 years. She nodded. She said she knew that. She said she respected that. Then she said, he mentioned you were instrumental in the trust situation, with his uncle's estate. I said, I was involved in a standard way. She said, he seems very settled about it, about the money. I thought he might be overwhelmed, but he seems like he's thought about it carefully. I said, he thinks about most things carefully. She smiled. She said, he gets that from you, I think. I said, he gets it from himself. She paused, then said, I just worry, that he's going to attract people who are interested in the money rather than in him. I imagine that's something you think about too. I looked at her, directly, for long enough that she would know I was looking and not reflexively looking away. I said, yes, I think about it. She held my gaze. She was good. I will say that. She was controlled and practiced, and she held the eye contact without flinching. But there was something, a fraction of a second, where she recalculated, where she felt the weight of the look and understood something about it. I have been doing structural assessments for 31 years. I know when something has registered. She said, I'm glad he has someone looking out for him.
I said, he always has. We finished the coffee. We were polite. We parted pleasantly. She said she hoped we could do this again sometime. I said, "I'm sure we will." I drove home and opened the legal pad, and I wrote one line. The approach is confirmed. Proceed. There are things you can do quietly if you know how to move through systems. My 31 years in engineering gave me a lot of that. The ability to read technical language, to understand what documents mean and what they don't mean, to know which questions to ask and who has the authority to answer them. I also had Bertram Howell, who had been Calvin's attorney for 2 decades and was, underneath his careful professional manner, deeply fond of Marcus and deeply irritated by the paralegal situation, and therefore more than willing to have a conversation about what protections were available. We talked in early July. I went to his office, which smelled of old wood and coffee and looked like a room that had not changed much since 1987, which I found reassuring. Bertram is in his late 60s and has the manner of a man who has seen most of the ways people behave badly around money and has stopped being surprised by any of them. He explained the existing structure of Marcus's trust. He explained the layer of asset protection already built into it by Calvin's careful estate planning, which was considerable. And then he explained, at my request, what additional instruments existed to formalize Marcus's intentions regarding the estate, and specifically, to document his understanding of the current situation and his wishes regarding any potential claims against the estate from individuals with familial standing. I said, his mother was not in the picture during the entire period the estate was being built. She had no contact with Calvin. She had no contact with Marcus for the first 14 years of his life, and minimal contact thereafter. Bertram said, "That is correct, and it is documented." I said, "If she were to make any kind of claim, on any basis, what would she need?" Bertram looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "She would need Marcus." I said, "She is working on that." Bertram said, "How far along is she?" I said, "Far enough that I'd like to move now." He nodded. He said, "Let me draw up the additional protective language for the trust instrument, and I'd recommend that Marcus also consider drafting a formal statement of intent, not legally binding in the estate sense, but useful as documentation of his understanding and his wishes, in his own words, at this point in time." I said, "He'll need to understand what he's doing and why." Bertram said, "Of course. This isn't something we do without him fully informed. He's the principal." I said, "I know. He'll want to be fully informed. That's why it'll work." I told Marcus on a Friday evening. Sonia was there, Daniel was there. I didn't call it a family meeting because Marcus dislikes that framing. It makes him feel managed. So I just said I had some things I'd found out that I wanted him to know. I told him what Sandra had found, the financial situation, the timing of the contact with the estate advisor, the connection to the paralegal. I laid it out the way I lay out a site report. Here are the observations. Here is the sequence. Here is the pattern. I did not tell him what to feel about it. I did not tell him what to conclude. I presented the structure and let him look at it. There was a long silence. Sonia put her hand over Daniel's. Marcus said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Pieces of it since March. All of it since June." He said, "And you waited." I said, "I needed the complete picture before I brought it to you, and I needed you to have your own time with her, your own read."
He said, "Because my read matters." I said, "Your read is the one that matters." He looked at the table for a while. The cat, Euler, jumped onto the arm of his chair, and Marcus put his right hand on the cat automatically, the way he always does, without looking down. He said, "She was kind to me." I said, "I believe that she was." He said, "But it wasn't about being kind to me." I said, "I don't think it was only about being kind to you." He looked up. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I set up a meeting with Bertram. With your permission, I'd like to take you in next week and walk you through some options for how to document your situation in a way that protects you going forward. Not from her specifically, from anyone who might try to use a relationship with you to access the estate. The protection is structural. It's not about her. He said, but it's also about her. I said, yes. He said, okay. He scratched the cat behind the ears. Then he said, can I ask you something?
I said, of course. He said, did you know, before she showed up, that someone like her would show up? I looked at him. I said, I thought there was a reasonable probability. He said, and you were ready. I said, I was prepared. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, good. Just that one word, good. The same word he had said 2 months earlier, when I'd told him I was making sure he was protected. He said it the same way both times. Not relieved, not grateful exactly. More like satisfied. Like a building that checks the math on its own supports and finds them sound. We went to Bertram's office the following Wednesday. Marcus, Daniel, and me. Sonia offered to come and Marcus said he was okay, but thanked her in a way that meant it.
Bertram walked us through everything in plain language, which he is good at. The ability to translate legal precision into human clarity is something I have found rare in most professionals, and valuable beyond measure when you find it. He explained the trust protections. He explained the additional instrument. He explained the statement of intent and what it would do and not do. Marcus asked 6 questions over the course of the meeting, each one precise, each one catching something in the explanation that needed clarification. Bertram answered each one without hesitation, which told me he had prepared for them, which told me he had thought carefully about who Marcus was. At the end, Marcus signed the additional instrument and dictated his statement of intent, which Bertram's associate recorded and formatted and printed, and which Marcus signed again. It was 4 paragraphs. It was written in Marcus's voice, the same precise, direct, unornamented way he says everything.
It described his understanding of the estate. It described his understanding of the current situation. It described his intentions regarding the estate and his existing family structure. And it said, in terms that were legally careful but humanly clear, that he had no intention of extending financial relationships to individuals who had been absent from his life for the majority of it. He did not name her. He did not need to. When we walked out, Marcus stopped at the top of the steps outside Bertram's building and looked out at the street. It was a warm day, late July, and the trees had the particular heavy green of high summer in Georgia. He said, I need to talk to her. I said, yes. He said, will you be there? I thought about it. I said, if you want me there, I'm there. But I think this one you do yourself. He nodded. He said, yeah. Then, I'll tell you what she says. I said, I know you will. He called her on a Thursday. He told me about it on Friday. I'm going to tell you what he told me, in his words, as closely as I can reconstruct them. He said he'd asked her to come to his apartment, which he'd never done before. All the previous meetings had been at restaurants or at the hospital. This was his space, his terms. She came on Thursday afternoon. He made tea, which is something he does when he wants to think clearly. Not because he particularly likes the ritual, but because the ritual creates structure, and structure helps him think. He said he let her talk first. She talked about how much the past few months had meant to her, about how getting to know him had been something she'd been afraid to hope for, about how she hoped this was the beginning of something ongoing. He let her finish. Then he said, I want to be honest with you about something. She said, of course. He said, I know about the financial advisor you contacted before you came to the hospital. I know about the timing. I know about the connection to the paralegal at the estate attorney's office. She went very still, he said. The particular stillness of someone who has been prepared for the possibility of this, but hoped to avoid it. She said, Marcus, he said, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what I know. And I'm telling you that I know it because my grandfather found out. And he told me. Because that's what he does. He makes sure I'm not walking into something without the full picture. She said, I wasn't trying to, he said. I believe you when you say you wanted to know me. I think that's true. I also think that the timing of your decision to find the courage to reach out is not a coincidence. And I think if I asked you directly whether you were aware of the inheritance before you came to the hospital, you'd have trouble answering me honestly. A long silence, he said. Long enough that he could hear her breathing. She said, I won't pretend that finding out about the estate wasn't part of what made me finally do something I'd been putting off for years. He said that was the most honest thing she had said to him in 4 months of meetings. She started crying. He said it seemed real. He said that was the complicated part. The tears seemed real, and he believed they were real, and it still didn't change anything about the situation. He said, I'm not going to shut the door completely. If you want a relationship with me, I'm willing to see if that's possible. But it will be slow, and it will be on my terms, and it won't involve my finances in any way. If that's something you can work with, we can try. If it isn't, then I think we should be honest about that too. She said she understood. He said, I need you to understand that my grandfather is going to know about anything that happens between us. Not because I'm reporting to him, but because he's someone I trust, and I don't keep things from the people I trust. She said she understood that too. He said, okay then. That was how it ended. He poured the tea out, which had gone cold, and she left, and he sat for a while with the cat, and then he called me. That was 5 months ago. Renee has been in contact twice since then, both times via text to Marcus, both times about things unrelated to money. Once about a show she thought he might like, once to say she was thinking of him after he mentioned he'd been dealing with a flare-up of the hip issue. Marcus responded to both. Briefly, but he responded. Daniel asked me once, in September, whether I thought it would amount to anything. Whether she'd actually changed, or whether she was playing a long game. I said, I don't know. I think she's doing both, maybe. I think people can want something genuinely and have the wrong reason for wanting it at the same time.
Those aren't always mutually exclusive. He said, and if it's a long game? I said, Marcus knows what he has. He knows what it's worth. He knows who he trusts and why. That's not something you can work around. Daniel was quiet. Then he said, You've been running this from the beginning. I said, I've been paying attention from the beginning. There's a difference. He said, Is there? I said, yes. I didn't stop her from coming. I didn't stop him from meeting her. I didn't make his decisions. I made sure he had the information he needed to make them himself. Daniel thought about that. He said, That's what you did for me too, after she left. I said, You and Marcus both do better with full information and space to use it. I've known that for 30 years. He looked at me a long time. Then he said, Thank you, Dad. I said, You don't have to thank me. He said, I know I don't. I drove home that night in the LeSabre, which has now crossed 191,000 miles, and which my neighbor Franklin says should have been retired 5 years ago. The October air had that particular quality it gets in Savannah, something between autumn and something that isn't quite autumn yet, a smell of changing that hasn't fully committed. The tomatoes in Franklin's garden were done for the season. The light was low and gold and ordinary. I sat in the driveway for a minute before going inside. I thought about Calvin, who had no children and who gave the closest thing he had to a grandchild $4 million, and trusted me, implicitly and without discussion, to make sure it landed right. I thought about Margaret, who spent 22 years watching estates open and rooms rearrange, and who knew, always, that the map of a family changes shape when money comes in, and you'd better know your load-bearing walls before that happens. I thought about Marcus in his apartment, with the cat on his chair, dictating 4 paragraphs in his own precise voice,
signing his name with his right hand that works better than his left, making the decision that was always his to make. I thought about what I know about structures, about how the ones that hold are not the ones that are rigid. They're the ones that were built right, on a solid foundation, over years of doing the work that doesn't get acknowledged because it looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. I opened the LeSabre door and went inside. There was a note from Marcus on my phone, a text sent while I was driving, that said only, "Euler says hi. Thanks for the Bertram thing. It was good." I typed back, "Tell Euler I said hi back. You did the work. I just drew the plans." He sent a single response, the small architect emoji, which is the closest he ever gets to a joke. I put the phone down on the kitchen table, next to the legal pad. I closed the legal pad. I thought about Margaret and Calvin and 31 years of looking at what's underneath the surface of things, of knowing that the structure is never the thing you can see. It's always the thing you've built where no one was watching. She left when Marcus was 3 years old, the day after a doctor used the word manageable, and she heard impossible. She reappeared when he was 32, the day after he signed paperwork that made him the beneficiary of a trust she hadn't known existed until someone told her. She thought she knew what she was walking into. She'd done her research, called her advisor, calculated her approach. She knew what Marcus was worth on paper. She never knew what he was worth where it counted. She didn't know it when she left. She still didn't know it when she came back. That's the only mistake she made in the end. But it was the one that mattered. I want to go back to something I skimmed over, because it deserves more than a skim. The 3 lunches Marcus had with Renee between April and June. I said he told me about them in pieces, with space between the pieces. What I didn't describe is what those pieces sounded like, what they cost him. The first lunch was at a restaurant in Midtown, a casual Italian place Marcus had been to before and therefore felt comfortable navigating. He told me about it on the phone that evening, standing on his small balcony the way he does when he's processing something. And his voice had a particular quality I have heard only a few times in his life. The quality of a person who has encountered something they cannot quite classify. Not distress, not joy. Something between the two that doesn't have a clean name. He said she had asked him about his childhood, which he thought was strange, or maybe appropriate, depending on how you looked at it. He said she had listened the way people listen when they are trying to locate something, trying to orient themselves inside a story they haven't been part of. He said she cried once, briefly, when he mentioned learning to type with modifications, and how long it had taken to find the right keyboard adaptation. He said the tears seemed to come before she could manage them, which is the kind of thing he notices. Not the emotion, but the lag time before the management of the emotion. He said the strangest part was that it felt familiar. Not her specifically, but the experience of someone trying to know him, trying to catch up on 30 years in the space of a lunch hour. He said it felt like being read. He said he didn't know if he liked it. I said, "You don't have to decide if you like it." He said, "I know, but I'm noticing it," which usually means something. The second lunch was harder. She brought up his disability directly, which the first lunch had skirted. She said she'd been thinking about what he'd said about early intervention and learning to adapt, and she said she was sorry she hadn't been there for that. She said, "I'm sorry," 4 separate times over the course of the meal, each one slightly different in framing, as if she were trying to find the version that would land the way she needed it to. He told me he had said to her, "What are you sorry for, specifically? Because I want to make sure I understand what you think you did." She had gone quiet, he said. Then she said she was sorry for leaving. He said, "You were sorry enough that you didn't come back." She said, I know. He said, for 19 years. She said, I know. He said, why now? And she said, and he told me this with a careful neutrality in his voice that told me he had replayed it many times. She said, I think I finally stopped being afraid of what you'd say. He had let that sit. He told me he believed her. He told me he also didn't think it was the whole truth. He said he was going to see what else emerged. The third lunch, in early June, was when the money questions started appearing. Not directly. He was too perceptive for anything direct to land without triggering the kind of response she didn't want. But they appeared in the way questions about money always appear when someone is approaching them sideways. Framed as curiosity, framed as concern, framed as interest in his well-being. She asked if he had gotten any guidance on managing the inheritance. She asked if he was working with anyone on the financial side. She asked, with what he described as careful brightness, if he was thinking of doing anything exciting with it, as if $4 million were a vacation fund rather than a fundamental change in the structure of his material life. He answered each question plainly and without detail. He said he had things handled. He said he was working with professionals. He said he hadn't made any decisions yet. Then she said, and this is the one I wrote down on the legal pad in double underline, she said, I just want to make sure you're not alone in navigating all this. You know you can always come to me if you need a sounding board. He said, I have a sounding board. She said, of course, your grandfather. He said, and my dad, and Sonia, and my attorney, and about 4 other people whose opinions I trust. She smiled. He said the smile didn't reach her eyes. He'd noticed that the first day in the hospital, and he noticed it again now, which meant it wasn't nervousness. It was the steady gap between what she was performing and what was underneath it. He said, I appreciate the offer. She said, I just want to be useful to you. He said, I know. He did not say, you're 19 years too late to be useful to me. He thought it. He told me he thought it. But he is not someone who uses words for impact when they don't serve a purpose, and that one would have served his feelings and not much else, so he left it unsaid. There is a week I haven't told you about, between the first lunch and the second one, when I had a bad few days. Not bad in any dramatic sense. No medical emergency, no crisis. Just the kind of bad that comes in quietly and sits down and doesn't explain itself. I've had these since Margaret died. They come about twice a year. I know them by the way the house sounds different, by the way my coffee tastes wrong, even when I make it the same way, by the way I sit in her armchair, the reading chair with the faded left armrest, which I have never replaced, because replacing it would mean deciding something I haven't decided. And I feel the specific weight of her absence that is different from the general weight of it. I sat in the chair on a Tuesday evening during that week, with the legal pad on my knee, and I thought about what I was doing and why I was doing it. The honest answer, the answer I've never needed to give anyone else, is that I started the legal pad the day Calvin told me, 9 months before he died, that he was going to leave the estate to Marcus. Calvin and I were on his back porch in Columbia. The last summer he was well enough to be outside reliably, and he told me his intentions, and he watched my face, and he said, You're already thinking about it. I said, I'm always thinking about it. He said, She'll come back, won't she? It wasn't a question quite. I said, If she finds out, very likely. Calvin said, And if she does? I said, Then we'll be ready. Calvin made a sound, not quite a laugh, something between agreement and satisfaction. He poured us both more sweet tea, and we sat there on his porch while the evening light went low and gold, the way it does over that particular part of Columbia in summer. And we didn't talk about Renee anymore. We talked about Marcus's software project. We talked about Calvin's tomatoes, which he was growing in containers that year because the bending had become too much for him. We talked about Margaret, who Calvin had loved like the sister he never had. And we sat in the comfortable way of two men who have known each other for 60 years and have stopped needing to fill silence. That's the last really good evening I had with him. He went into hospital care in October. He passed in February. I sat at his bedside on the Thursday afternoon, holding his hand, and I thought, the work is for him too. Not just for Marcus. For Calvin, who spent 30 years building something and wanted it to go where it would do what he intended it to do. So I did the work. I started the legal pad. I made the calls, and in the week between the first and second lunches, sitting in Margaret's chair, what I felt was not doubt about whether I'd done the right things. What I felt was the specific exhaustion of vigilance maintained over months and years, the way a building carries its load, constantly, silently, without being acknowledged for the effort of holding. I thought about Marcus at 3 years old, standing at the window in the house in Savannah, asking where Mama went. I thought about Daniel in the doorway, holding him.
I thought about the years of Tuesday and Thursday drives to therapy, the years of legal pad notes on a different subject, the notes I'd kept throughout Marcus's childhood, which Daniel doesn't know about, which tracked every appointment, every developmental milestone, every medication, every adjustment to his therapy plan. Because I had watched my mother's care for my father in the last years of his life get contested because no one had kept the records. And I had decided then that records would be kept. The habit of documentation comes from a place I don't often think about directly. It comes from the knowledge that vigilance is not dramatic. It is daily. It is unglamorous. It is the work that looks like nothing from the outside, and without which everything falls. I sat in the chair until the room was dark.
Then I got up and made dinner and called Marcus, who was having a good week and wanted to tell me about a programming problem he'd solved in a way that made him particularly satisfied. And I listened to him talk about it for 20 minutes, and I was glad, with the specific gladness that is not excitement, but is more durable than excitement. The gladness of a thing continuing to hold. In mid-July, while Bertram was drawing up the additional protective language for the trust, I had a second meeting with Sandra Pruitt. She called me first to tell me something she hadn't included in the formal report. A mutual contact had told her that Renee had, in the weeks after her second lunch with Marcus, consulted not only a financial advisor, but also a family law attorney. The family law attorney consultation was brief, according to what Sandra had been told, and Sandra was careful to say she could not verify the substance of it. But the subject of the consultation was, reportedly, the legal basis for a dependent relative's standing in estate matters in the state of Georgia. I said, she was looking for a legal angle. Sandra said, it appears she was exploring her options. I said, and? Sandra said, Georgia doesn't offer much there. The estate is in trust. It was established by a third party with no legal obligation to the mother. And there's no basis for a dependent claim, since the beneficiary is an adult with full legal capacity. The family law attorney would have told her that quickly. I said, so she shifted to the personal approach. Sandra said, that's my read. I thanked her. I added the note to the legal pad, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, exactly, and not satisfaction. Something closer to sorrow. Not for myself, for the situation. For the specific sadness of a person who had looked at a grown man who had survived and built and adapted and made himself, and had seen, first, an opportunity. I thought about what Marcus had said at 20. She didn't know it when it mattered. I thought about how that sentence applied in both directions. She didn't know what he was worth when he was 3 and needed her to stay. And she still didn't know what he was worth, now that he had $4 million and she wanted to be near him. She had never known how to see him correctly. That was the tragedy, if there was one. Not cruelty, misperception. The persistent inability to locate the actual weight-bearing element in the structure. The night before Marcus met with Bertram to sign the documents, I did something I don't often do. I took out the legal pad, not the current one, the original one, the one from the year Marcus was born, and I read through it from the beginning. I have a legal pad for every year since Marcus was born.
They go back 32 years in a box on the shelf in my closet, in chronological order. Margaret used to tease me about it. She said I was the only man she'd ever known who kept annual logs of his grandchild's life. And I said I wasn't logging his life, I was keeping records. And she said that's the same thing said by someone who doesn't want to admit he's sentimental. And she was right, as she generally was. The first legal pad covers the year Marcus was born, through the year he turned 1. There's a lot in it: doctor's appointments, developmental notes, the things the physical therapist said and the things the occupational therapist said, and the specific exercises and the specific adaptations. There are also other things I didn't plan to write. Notes on what Marcus was like in a particular week. The first time he laughed at something, really laughed. Not just the reflexive laughter of a young baby, but the laugh of a person who has found something genuinely funny.
The first time he communicated a preference, clearly and unmistakably, about something he wanted rather than something he needed. The first time he pushed back on something I was doing that he disagreed with, which happened at 14 months and involved the placement of his cup on the left side rather than the right side of his tray, and which I remember because he looked at me with an expression of such precise annoyance that I almost laughed. I read through it in my kitchen the night before the Bertram meeting, with a cup of coffee that went cold as I read. It took about 2 hours. I didn't read quickly. I wanted to remember why I had been doing the work. Not the recent work, the current legal pad with its investigations and its documentation and its careful structural analysis. The original work, the 32 years of being present. I read about the Tuesday and Thursday drives. I read about the speech therapy sessions where Marcus would come out furious because he had worked hard and the words still didn't come out the way he intended, and then, within 20 minutes, be explaining something to me with total coherent intensity, because what he lacked in easy oral fluency, he compensated for in precision of thought. I read about the school years, which had their difficulties, the children who were unkind, the teachers who either underestimated or overprotected, the particular adolescent loneliness of being different in the ways Marcus was different in a world that makes difference difficult. I read about the good years, too. The computer, the first coding project, the college decision process, which was meticulous and thorough in a way that made me understand he had been paying attention to me all along. I read about the year he turned 20 and the conversation at dinner about his mother. I had written it down that night, in the margins of that year's legal pad, because I knew I would want to remember exactly how he said it. She didn't know it when it mattered. I closed the pad. I sat for a while. Then I went to bed. The next morning I drove Marcus to Bertram's office, and he signed his name in the precise way he signs everything, with concentration and without ceremony. And it was done. There is one more thing I want to tell you. In August, about 3 weeks after Marcus's conversation with Renee, she sent him a longer text than usual. He forwarded it to me the same day. The text said that she understood where he was coming from. It said she wasn't going to pretend the timing of everything was a coincidence, because clearly he already knew it wasn't. It said she had started out with the wrong motivation, or maybe a mixed motivation, and she knew that. But she said she had meant what she said about wanting to know him.
She said she was going to leave it in his hands, and she wasn't going to push. And if he ever decided he wanted to explore some kind of relationship, she was there. If he didn't, she understood. Marcus texted back after a day. He said, "I'll be in touch." He has not been in touch. But he has not closed the door entirely either. I asked him about it once, in September, and he said, "I'm not ready to decide yet, and I don't have to decide yet." I said, "That's right." He said, "She was honest at the end. I'll give her that." I said, "People can be honest after they've been something else first. It's not nothing." He said, "No, it's just not enough yet." I said, "Yet is a useful word." He smiled. He turned back to his computer. Euler relocated from the mat to his lap, which the cat does when Marcus is working on something that requires a lot of concentration, as if the cat understands that ballast is useful. I drove home in the LeSabre.
The engine runs a little rough when it's cold, which it was beginning to be in September. That first edge of the season where you know what's coming without quite being there yet. I have been told for 15 years that the car is due for replacement. I have never replaced it. It runs. It carries what I need it to carry. It gets me where I'm going. That is what I need from a car. That is, I suppose, what I need from most things. Calvin used to say that the problem with most people, when they looked at old things, was that they saw age and not history. He said, they see the years on the surface, the wear, the places where time has done its ordinary work, and they subtract those years from the value. They don't understand that the years are the value, that the only structures you can trust are the ones that have been holding for a long time and are still standing. I think about that when I think about Marcus.
About what he has been building, quietly, without announcement, across 32 years that asked more of him than they ask of most people. The speech therapy and the adaptive equipment and the coding and the cat named after a mathematician, and the dry humor that appears suddenly and precisely, like a structural engineer locating the load point in a room full of people who don't know what they're standing on. I think about Renee walking into room 412 with the coffee and the rehearsed smile, seeing a man in a wheelchair with $4 million in a trust account, and seeing, even trying to see, only the surface of what she was looking at. She saw the years without the history. She saw the age without the accumulation. She saw the disability without the character. She saw the inheritance without the man who would have been exactly who he was with or without it. She left when he was 3 years old, and she came back when she thought what he had would be useful to her, and what she found instead was someone who had been carefully and thoroughly and quietly prepared for exactly that moment, by a grandfather who had been keeping records for 32 years in legal pads on a shelf in his closet, who drove a car with 191,000 miles on it, who made coffee he forgot to drink, who had learned long ago that the structures that hold are the ones built right, from the foundation, in the years when no one was watching. She thought she knew what she was walking into. She was wrong in the only way that mattered. She didn't know me. She didn't know that I had been there every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 years, in the waiting room of a therapy office on Habersham Street, reading the same battered copy of a structural engineering journal, and then setting it down when the door opened and my grandson came out.
She didn't know that I had driven to every school event and every college orientation and every medical appointment with a legal pad in the back seat, keeping the records that no one asked me to keep, because I had decided 32 years ago in a delivery room in February that whatever this child needed, he would have it. She didn't know that what I am, at my core, is a man who looks at structures, buildings, families, systems, people, and finds the fault lines and documents them and prepares for the load. She didn't know that I had seen her coming 9 months before she arrived. She didn't know any of it. And that specifically, is why Marcus is fine. That is why Marcus was always going to be fine. She left when he was 3 years old. She came back the day he inherited $4 million.
And she found a man of 32 with a cat named Euler and a precise sense of his own worth, surrounded by people who had been there from the beginning, backed by documents she never expected and protections she never saw, designed by someone she dismissed as just the grandfather, the quiet old man in the background, the one she thanked for looking out for him, the one she had coffee with once and thought she had read. She didn't read me. She never knew what was underneath. That was her one mistake, but it was the one that mattered.